Well, welcome everybody. Welcome whether you have come from just round the corner, or a few hours down the road, or from Australia, Kenya, Romania, or wherever you've come from. Welcome. It's really great to be here. My name is Elizabeth Ritchie. If you've got any questions or worries, then come and find me, and I will try and solve any of your conference-related problems. This is a very special year. It's a very important year. Across much of the world, historical commemorations in 2014 are marking the outbreak of war a century ago. And that event profoundly shaped the 20th century here on the North Coast. However, we are spending 3 days in this delightful location to mark two other anniversaries. The first, and possibly the better known, is the notorious Strathnaver clearances. And the other is the 300th birthday of the great poet, cattle dealer, and political and social commentator Rob Down. These two events have inspired a series of talks that examine the nature of the changing political, social, economic, and cultural situation in the Northern Highlands, both before, during, and after the clearances. And as I've been looking through the abstracts, I've noticed that there's some running themes through this conference. One of them is the political negotiations between different social groups, landlords, taxmen, tenants. Another is the active agency of ordinary people. And another are the relationships between people and the land, this land. So, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon, James Hunter. Jim is well known in three areas: in journalism, in Highland history, and in Highland politics. And these three great passions combine in a lot of Jim's work. His first book, The Making of the Crofting Community, combined an enviable writing ability with a passionately argued thesis about the self-empowerment of marginalised Highlanders. And this perspective and these abilities have underpinned Jim's other books on land issues and emigration. They've also underpinned his political work with the Scottish Crofters Union and Highlands and Islands Enterprise. And more recently, they've inspired his project to develop a Centre for History at the University of the Highlands and Islands. And this afternoon, Jim is talking to us about some of his current research on Sutherland. His talk is entitled Savages from Scotland, the North American Dimension of the Sutherland Clearances.
I want, first of all, to say something about the Centre for History. There was mention of the Crofters Union. My great late friend and mentor to do with the Crofters Union was a Lewis man called Angus MacLeod. And Angus was the founding father of the union. And when we were setting it up and afterwards, when I was in Lewis, I would stay with Angus and Annie, his wife, overnight. They're both now dead. And the time would come to about 10:30 or 11, and we'd get a cup of tea, and then Annie would go off to bed, and she'd say to Angus, "Now, remember, Angus, Jim has a very busy day tomorrow, and he needs his sleep." and then Angus would say, "We'll have a dram." And then he would say, to sort of start the conversation, "I've been reflecting." And what he was reflecting on might be anything from the iniquities of the Crofters Commission to the intricacies of Calvinist theology. The two actually are quite similar in many ways. But I've been coming down the Strathnaver on my way here this morning. I was kind of reflecting on the various times and in various capacities I've knocked about this area over the last 40 years. Initially to give talks under the auspices of Donald Domond of the then Aberdeen University Extramural Department on the Highland Land League and related matters. And then as a journalist working first of all on the staff of the Present Journal, and then as a freelance with the Scotsman and the BBC and anyone else who would pay me. And then with the Crofters Union. And indeed there are some veterans of the original Crofters Union here today, so it's good to see you all. And then later on, still back to sort of writing, and I stopped on the way down Strathnaver. I always stop there if I'm passing to look at the little monument to Donald MacLeod of Gloomy Memories fame. And that was put there by a man called John Kenneth Mackay, whom I knew as the chairman of the branch of the Crofters Union here, and he was also a postman. And it was he who was responsible for that monument. And then I was involved in HIE and Highlands and Islands Enterprise and back here in that sort of capacity. And what I was thinking about was that all through that period, it would never have occurred to me, or indeed I think to anyone else, that there would one day be a flourishing university department of history here in Sutherland. And now there is. It's 9.5 years since I became the director of the UHI Centre for History. It didn't, to be honest, take much directing because it consisted of me being paid 3 days a week, and there was no budget, and there was no staff, and there was no resources, and there was nothing else. And my remit was to turn this into something or other that would hopefully continue. And that's what's happened. And the Centre for History today is a very successful organisation. And there are some of its postgraduate students here and some of its, or most of, a lot of its staff here anyway. And I just want to say that and to pay tribute to these folk because I know this won't put much butter on their bread, but I am very, very proud of what you guys have done. It's been terrific, so thank you very much. And since the theme of this is in North America, if this was North America, you would all cheer at that point, so cheer. And it's sort of indicative of the success of the Centre for History that we have as a visiting Carnegie professor here, Eric Richards, whose involvement with Sutherland and its history is at least as old as mine, if not marginally older. And that is excellent as well, because Eric pioneered the academic study of certainly the Sutherland clearances. He doesn't get all of it right, but apart from, but at least he's had a good stab at it, you know. Now, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit. I've got notes here that will allow me to talk until it gets dark, but I'll try and not do that. And I'll go back to what we just saw in a moment, because there was mention by Elizabeth, of the Great War. And if you go along and look at the War Memorial here in Bettyhill, you'll see that it honours 20 men from this locality who died in the Great War. And this afternoon, in a small way, I want to honour other men from hereabouts who died in battle. And these men were 13 in number. And they came from this parish of Farr, and they have no memorial. And their deaths took place not in the course of a long war, but on a single Sunday morning, the morning of the 8th of January, 1815. And what I want to do is just read their names in their memory, which, as far as I know, has never been done here before, but it may have been. They were William Mackay, Hugh Mackay, William MacLeod, John MacLeod, William Mackay, Angus Mackay, Robert Mackay, William MacLeod, John Mackay, Adam Glass, William Mackay, Hugh Mackay, and Alexander McIntosh. I'm conscious reading out these names that it's quite possible that they hardly ever heard their names in that form. They would have known them, of course, in Gaelic. These men died at Chalmette, which is or was a sugarcane plantation beside the Mississippi River, a few miles downstream from New Orleans. And if I can have the first map. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Well, you mostly know, I'm sure, or you all know where New Orleans is, but it's there. And they were soldiers in the British Army's 93rd Regiment of Foot. I went to Chalmette, Evelyn, my wife and I, in May this year just to have a look at it. It's well preserved. It was a famous victory, of course, for the Americans. They were assaulting positions, this British force, held by a makeshift and outnumbered American army. And the Americans were a force that the British officers, mostly aristocrats, of course, despised. This is a classic case of what happens to the British military when you despise the opposition, as happened in Singapore and Gallipoli. And they were wrong to do so. Britain's casualties in the Battle of New Orleans, as it became known, were well in excess of 2,000, as you saw there. The American casualties there were exaggerated on the screen. They weren't 71, they were less than 20. So over 2,000 British casualties, less than 20 American casualties. The battle was the last significant engagement in the War of 1812, so-called, and this was a British-American conflict, which I'm going to outline, impacted very, very much on Sutherland. The 93rd Regiment was first mustered on the 24th August 1800, not very far from here in Strathnaver at a place called Langdale. 653 men gathered there. They were raised mostly, not exclusively, but mostly on the Sutherland estate at the instigation of its owners, the Countess of Sutherland, who was soon, of course, to be the Marchioness of Stafford, and her husband, who was the future Marquis. Now, an earlier force, the Sutherland Fencibles, had been raised on the estate in 1793, the year that Britain went to war with revolutionary France. But in 1799, the Fencibles, a home defence regiment, essentially, had been disbanded on the basis that the men who were disbanded would now join this new formation, which was commanded by the Countess's cousin, General William Weems. But Weems, to his surprise, and certainly to the surprise of the Sutherland estate management, found very few recruits forthcoming. Because it was said from the estate side, ex-Fencible men had picked up, quote, crude and undigested notions, which meant pro-democracy ideas, when stationed in the Lowlands and in Ireland. And so there was now a mix of carrot and stick to fill up the ranks of the regiment. The stick consisted, in effect, of conscripting the sons of estate tenants, and the carrot was promises to these men's parents that they'd be left in undisturbed possession of their farms. Now, if you fast forward from 1800 to 1813, and to the Strath of Kildonnan rebellion that began in January that year, in response to, of course, the planned clearance of the Strath, 4 weeks into the Kildonnan uprising, the estate factor, or an estate factor, Patrick Siller, met in the Strath with some of the leading rebels. And they produced the written guarantees, or some of them did, that they'd got from General Weems. Now, Siller, as the estate correspondence has it, found, quote, the obligations contained in the papers he was shown had expired. There was small print, as it were, to that effect. And turning to the Kildonnan men, again, I quote, he told them so. So that the guarantees dished out in 1800 were time-limited is clear enough, but in Sutherland, throughout the clearance period and long after, people never ceased believing that, legal niceties notwithstanding, bargains solemnly made in connection with recruitment had been casually ignored and set aside. Now, there was that enhanced, well, there would have been bitterness anyway, but it certainly enhanced, it caused a great deal of bitterness. And that was enhanced, of course, by the sacrifice, by the slaughter of so many men at Chalmette. Mixed up in this also, of course, was the notion that, going back to clan times, that you, as it were, did military service for your chief, and that this carried with it obligations on the other side on the part of the chief, which was certainly not being carried through if you were losing your land. Now, these protests, the protests in Kildonnan in 1813, are sometimes seen as pretty spontaneous, disorganized, and hopeless episodes. But they were none of these things. The Kildonnan uprising was actually well planned, efficiently directed, and it was by no means ineffective. In charge of the proceedings was a 14-strong committee, which met regularly, consisting of prominent tenants in the Strath, and in no way short of cash, some of which they spent on sending to London the man that the Kildonnan folk employed to act on their behalf. And this was William MacDonald from Brora, who until 1812 and his retirement, had been a recruiting sergeant here in Sutherland in the north for the 93rd Regiment. Now, MacDonald, on going to London, had various remits, among them offering the authorities 700 new recruits from Sutherland. Recruits that were to be forthcoming, however, only if either prospective soldiers' parents got security of tenure, or the 700 men, together with their families, were guaranteed resettlement in British North America. In other words, what's now Eastern Canada. Crucial to MacDonald's mission was his former commanding officer, General Weems, the man who'd organised the regiment in the first place, who was now retired and living in London. Weems had considerable respect for MacDonald, for the sergeant. In 1812, when MacDonald retired, Weems had ensured that MacDonald got an enhanced military pension of £33 a year, which was then a pretty biggish sum. It was more than double a school teacher's salary, for example. Now, in March 1813, Weems welcomed MacDonald to his London home. I'm not sure if he stayed there, but he certainly spent quite a bit of time there. And that's where he met, in fact, the Stafford's man of business, James Loch. Loch, perhaps predictably, made no concessions to MacDonald and made sure that he wasn't going to be seen by any government ministers or whatever. But Weems appears to have taken a rather different tack. Now, in Memorabilia Domestica, which, as I'm sure you all or most of you know, is the autobiography that Donald Sage, the Kildonan minister's son, wrote, Sage there describes what happened in Kildonan when in 1800 Weems signed up young men whose fathers got the guarantees that I mentioned, which led to the papers that were shown, of course, to Siller. Now, I think it's at least possible, though I wouldn't say that it was a dead certainty, but I think it's at least possible that Weems felt a continuing responsibility for people who, despite his promises to them, were now facing eviction. At all events, Weems put MacDonald in touch with another senior military man, a man in a position, as it seemed, to give office to the Kildonan people's North American ambitions. This was Colonel, later General Sir Archibald McLean, who was a Gaelic-speaking soldier from the Isle of Mull and a veteran of campaigns in India, in Portugal and Spain. It's one of the fascinations to me of looking into the Sutherland clearances. It's the complexity of attitudes to it and the sort of alliances on the opposition side, as it were, that emerged. And they were by no means straightforward, and it wasn't just, as it were, the commonality versus the landed gentry. There was quite a few of, as it were, the gentry on the side of the opposition. And Maclean also seems to have had a lot of sympathy for the Sutherland people. Well, Maclean at this point was looking forward, as he put it in a letter to his brother back in Mull, to trimming the Yankees' jackets and making them caper to the tune of Yankee Doodle. This was because he'd been offered command of a regiment that Thomas Douglas, Earl of Selkirk, was looking to recruit and then deploy in North America. Now, a word about Selkirk. He is a fascinating figure, Selkirk. He's sort of key to the story, and one could certainly talk about Selkirk until it got dark. He was a student contemporary of Walter Scott in Edinburgh University, and like Scott, he of course didn't come from the Highlands. He in fact came from Kirkcudbrightshire, which is about as far away from the Highlands as you can get in Scotland. But like Scott, he was fascinated by the Highlands, and unlike Scott, he was radical in his politics. This is Selkirk, I mean. First getting on the wrong side of the Staffords, as it happened in 1792, when the future Marquis was the British ambassador in revolutionary Paris. And there, perhaps unsurprisingly, the Countess made good friends with Marie Antoinette, who was about literally to lose her head. And of course, the Staffords were, to put it mildly, not in sympathy with the revolutionaries, but Selkirk had come to cheer them on. So this did not put him in the Staffords' good books. But Selkirk, who travelled widely in the Highlands and who actually learned Gaelic, which is, I think, extremely unusual, if not unique, for somebody of his background at this time. He was easily, I think, the best informed external critic of the policy of clearance at the beginning of the 19th century. He was an advocate of settling victims of eviction in British North America on land he acquired for this purpose. And first of all, in Prince Edward Island, which is there, and then later in Ontario, but leaving that aside, in the area that I'm particularly going to talk about, around Red River, now Winnipeg. It's interesting, if you go to Prince Edward Island, PEI, as I've done at various points, you find that amongst the descendants, he settled about 800 immigrants there in 1805, mainly from Skye and the West Coast. And the descendants of these people still are, they really, to say they honour Selkirk is an understatement. He's still a hero in PEI. But as I say, he then turned his attention westwards to the Red River area. And that was a place that already had connections with Sutherland, particularly in the person of a man called Donald Mackay. Now, if like me, you've sort of explored the fur trade, the North American fur trade a bit, you come across Donald Mackay. He features in quite a few writings of Canadian historians and books and articles and so on. And indeed, an Oregon fur trade historian that I've had contact with, a man called John Jackson, wrote some time ago a biography, or at least he began a biography of Mackay. It hasn't been published, but a typescript of it is now in the UHI Centre for History library that John gifted to the library. And I think he should be known in Sutherland because what he set in train was extraordinarily successful. I would argue that in some ways Mackay had a more decisive influence on the shape, so to speak, of the modern world than the Staffords ever had. Brandon, Manitoba, which began as one of Mackay's trading posts, nowadays has a population 5 times greater than Sutherland. Winnipeg, in whose origins Mackay also had a big hand, contains many more people than Glasgow. And the Sutherland improvements of the Staffords, I guess, would deliver in contrast only long-run disappointment and decline. Now, Mackay, who, as I say, ought to be better known in Sutherland, was born in Strathbrora in 1753. By 1779, like lots of other Highlanders, he was trading out of Montreal and heading west. This is where the fur trade was based. And he was away to the west. He actually he was certainly as far west as the Mandan River villages on the upper Missouri. Now, the renowned American explorers, Lewis and Clark, who Americans think were the first white men across the continent, which is not true, were, because Alexander Mackenzie was, Lewis and Clark got to the Mandan villages and wrote at great length about them 25 years after Mackay. And Mackay was very much his own man. He's a fascinating figure. He refused to join the Northwest Company, which was being put together at the later stages of the century, of the 18th century, in Montreal by men like Simon McTavish from Stratherick and Alexander Mackenzie, whom I mentioned from Lewis. And by the 1790s, the Nor'westers, as they were known, were the dominant force in the fur trade. And they were made so in part because they railroaded out of the territory, as it were, literally, freelancers like Donald Mackay, who was beat up and robbed by the Nor'westers at Grand Portage on Lake Superior, which was a key way station in the fur trade. And it was that sort of experience that led Mackay to sign on with the Montreal Consortium's great rivals, the Hudson's Bay Company. Now, there needs here to be some fur trade geopolitics. The Bay Company was an archetypally imperial concern. It was founded in the 17th century, it was based in London, and it had a charter giving it possession of all the lands drained by all the rivers flowing into Hudson Bay, which is an area that is sort of roughly like that. and in fact it goes down into the northern part of the United States. It's far, far bigger than Europe. But the Baymen were, for ages, hopelessly unenterprising. They seldom ventured much beyond their trading centre on the bay, a centre they called York Factory, where the First Nation trappers, Aboriginal First Nation trappers, brought their furs. The Northwest Company Highlanders could not have been more different. They were ruthlessly entrepreneurial. I want to emphasize that because when you read about the Highlanders in the Highlands at this time, they are always thought to be utterly unentrepreneurial. Take them to Canada and they suddenly changed tack. I don't think they changed tack at all. I think they were entrepreneurial before they left, but that's by the way. Now, their other big difference to the Bay Company was that they adopted, this is the Highlanders I mean, Aboriginal or Indian technology, and especially the birchbark canoe. The Bay Company at this point would have nothing to do with birchbark canoes, which they thought were a kind of thing that was fit for savages. And it was the birchbark canoe that enabled the Nor'westers to range across the continent by way of Red River in the later decades, the last decade or two of the 18th century, and right up into Athabasca, hugely rich fur trading grounds in Athabasca. But Red River was the key way station on the canoe routes to the west. And Mackenzie, of course, would cross the continent in 1793 to the Pacific. Many years ahead, I stress, of Lewis and Clark. I always, giving talks like this in the United States, it's great because I've never heard of Mackenzie, you know. So the Nor'westers were grabbing furs that, in accordance with the Baymen's theoretical monopoly, should have been destined for York Factory, not for Montreal. And so that was why the Bay Company were interested in having Donald Mackay on side. He was invited to go back to London in 1788 to put his thinking to the company's board of directors. He was actually so honoured, as it were, by the Bay Company, they gave him a ceremonial sword, which his descendants, who are now in Nova Scotia, still have. And this thinking was that, Mackay's thinking was the Bay Company had to move into the interior, not least to Red River, where Mackay was to spend several seasons himself on the Bay Company's behalf. But he was, as I've indicated, a hard man to get on with. And the Quebecois French of the Montreal fur trade, the Nor'wester fur trade, he was Le Malin, the devil. And to Bay Company colleagues, he was simply Mad Mackay. Now, by 1806, he'd retired from the Bay to Strathbrora, to a place called Askell Moor near Gordonbush. And there, now in his 50s at this point, Donald Mackay set up home with the Sutherland teenager, who became his wife, and with two teenage sons, William and Donald, who he'd brought back from the Bay. And their skins were darker than was standard in the early 19th century Strathbrora, and their first language wasn't Gaelic, it was Cree. At Askell Moor, this family lived in what was in effect a log cabin, which is kind of really intriguing, that it's probably the first log house, well, certainly in modern times, to have been built in Sutherland. And there in 1812, as it happened, in his log cabin at Askell Moor, Donald Mackay got a letter from Lord Selkirk. 6 or 7 years earlier, Selkirk had visited Montreal and he'd met Alexander Mackenzie, whose account of his travels across the continent had been published in 1801. From Mackenzie's writings, and now from Mackenzie himself, Selkirk hears of an area that few Europeans had then seen, an area where, in the vicinity of Red River, around Winnipeg, the forests that cover much of eastern North America give way to endless grasslands. These grasslands were what Mackenzie's voyageurs called les prairies, the prairies. Now, Red River was 1,000 miles west of the frontier of European settlement, which at that point was about here, and there is Red River there, and this is a map on Canada is a very big place, he said with penetrating insight. But it's about 1,000 miles from there to there. So it was Red River 1,000 miles away from the nearest other European settlement, more or less. But its prospects, Selkirk thought, were dazzling. Hence his growing involvement with the Bay Men, who were in law, of course, Red River's owners. Red River was dominated by the North West Company, but in law, legally, because of the charter going way back, all that area belonged to the Bay Company. Now, this involvement ended in Sutherland acquiring a territory. It cost him about 10 shillings. It was 4 times the size of Scotland. And this was a territory Selkirk needed urgently to know more about, and hence his correspondence with Donald Mackay at Ascalmore in Strathbrora, who had spent longer in the Red River country than anyone else then resident in Britain, or indeed in Europe. To enter minutely into the nature of this country, Mackay wrote to Selkirk, would need a whole volume. But drawing on charts and journals, he was a tremendous map maker, Mackay. Drawing on charts and journals he'd brought back to Strathbrora, he certainly did what he could. The maps, incidentally, wouldn't be superseded, some of them, until the beginnings of aerial surveying techniques. I've seen tribes of Indians that never saw Europeans before. Mackay wrote, he's talking there about the Mandan and the Shoshone. And like Selkirk, Mackay was certain that the prairies could be farmed. And meanwhile, he said they were awash with natural resources. This is a classic instance of what North Americans in the 19th century called boosterism. You sort of extol the virtues of whatever place is to be next settled. Red River, Mackay wrote, hath buffaloes, deer of different kinds, and in the fall and spring, geese, swans, ducks, heath hens, partridges, rabbits, etc. As for the climate of the country you wish me to describe, Donald Mackay informed Selkirk, it was superior, he said, to many of British North America's already settled districts, which was indeed the case. Now, his exchanges with Mackay reinforced Lord Selkirk's faith in his Red River project. This is part of the reason why I think Mackay needs to be more known about in Sutherland. It was a key figure in all this. But the project, Selkirk's project, had run into real big trouble. In June 1812, the USA had declared war on this country with the aim, not least, of conquering what's now Eastern Canada. Now, a less committed man than Selkirk might have given up at this point, but instead he formulated a new plan. Britain in 1812 was 20 years, more or less, into war with France. The country was maintaining by far and away the world's biggest navy and sustaining huge land forces in continental Europe, without French-style conscription as well. So manpower shortages were bad and getting worse, and hence Selkirk's January 1813 offer to the military authorities. He'd personally raise a Highland regiment. This regiment would be deployed in British North America and eventually disbanded at Red River, and the government would take the disbanded soldiers' families there. That was the idea. So in March 1813, Selkirk's negotiating this idea with Whitehall when Sergeant William MacDonald, the Kildonan people's emissary whom I mentioned, comes knocking at the door of General Weems, who, as I mentioned also, puts MacDonald in touch with Colonel Archibald McLean, who in turn takes MacDonald to see Selkirk. Now, since the sergeant had an offer 700 men who wished to serve in North America, on condition that they and families were in time resettled there, this Selkirk-MacDonald meeting was a match made in heaven. Each of them was getting from the other exactly what they wanted. So MacDonald was soon hastening back north to make a list of families up for military service and ultimately for Red River. And in Sutherland, William Young, the Stafford's main man hereabouts, was just then listing other names of people from the Strath of Kildonan who were prepared to take 3-acre crofts up here on the north coast. Well, weeks into this process, Young had a dozen families on his list, and MacDonald's list was well over 1,000. I'm afraid the bad news for you guys is Red River was a heck of a lot more popular than Bettyhill. Yeah. But then things started to go wrong. There was nothing inherently impossible, it's worth emphasising, about the Selkirk recruitment, demobilisation, resettlement scheme. There were plenty of precedents for this from the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War when Britain took Canada from France, and from the War of American Independence. But the government had little trust in a maverick like Selkirk, and so the regiment concept died a death. But Selkirk, to his credit, continued to stick by Kildonan, looking to get just under 100 people from Kildonan onto 1813's Bay Company convoy to York Factory, from where they'd voyage inland up the Hayes and Nelson rivers, I'll come to this in a moment, to Lake Winnipeg and onto the Red River country. By May 1813, Selkirk was in Sutherland. He rode up Strathbrora, incidentally, to have dinner with Donald Mackay in his log cabin. And he met with the Kildonan rebels, by whom he was mightily impressed, especially by John Sutherland, a leading member of the protest group's organising committee. In June, John Sutherland, his wife and family, along with some 90 others, left Kildonan for Red River. And so began, it's what now began, I think, was arguably the worst and certainly the most protracted journey ever made by European immigrants to North America. It began Kildonan to Thurso, across the Pentland Firth to Stromness, stepping off point for the Bay, and then across the Atlantic, tangoing with an American privateer en route, and worse, typhus broke out on the ship. There was heavy ice in Hudson Strait. Interesting reflection, there would be no ice there today in the summer. More typhus. They were held up in the ice for 2 or 3 weeks. And they were put ashore, not at York Factory as planned. York Factory is down about here, but up at Churchill, which is much further north. And again, you must remember this map shows huge areas of land. And the typhus sufferers were put ashore, well, everybody was put ashore in Churchill, and they were in tents in a place they had to be kept isolated, in a place known as Swoop's Cove at the mouth of the Churchill River, which is a 1,000-mile-long river that enters the bay at Churchill. And they were nursed there by a young Kildonan woman called Kate Macpherson, who was the hero of this story, or the heroine. Now, inevitably, some of these folk died, and among them was John Sutherland, whom I mentioned, who was seen very much as the leader of the group. Now, the only grave of these people that's marked, or that was marked then and is still marked, is that's John Sutherland's grave. And that's a close-up, and it's hard to read, but it's very crudely carved, John Sutherland, 1813. Now, that grave, which is beside the shore, as you can see, of Hudson Bay, is, I think, sort of emblematic of an awful lot of what the Staffords and their henchmen got so badly wrong about Sutherland. John Sutherland was very much a man of substance. He was well-doing by the standards of that time, on the back of a lot of cattle and whiskey, making whiskey, I mean. Well, he probably drank some as well, but he made some. He was respected. He was enterprising, as Selkirk saw at once. Selkirk thought he would be a key asset in Red River. He was the sort of person on whom, in a better ordered world, you'd base a development strategy for a place like Sutherland. But he was, of course, the sort of person who instead the Staffords had kicked out. And John Sutherland had other strengths. His reputation depended on a number of things. He was a tradition bearer. He was steeped in Gaelic culture. He was steeped above all in the Fenian sagas, these epics of great warriors like Cuchulainn and Dermot and so on. And these go back to Iron Age Ireland, but they survived in the heads of people like this man from Kildonan. And John Sutherland would tell these stories, or some of them, in the kitchen of the manse in Kildonan. And according to Donald Sage, his telling of even one story would last for 3 or 4 hours. And that was fairly standard. It's actually worth bearing in mind when you read the sort of crap that the improvers wrote about the culture they were destroying, that Gaelic was not, as they thought, some sort of barbaric jargon, as Patrick Seller described it. Gaelic actually had, for what it's worth, it was the first European language other than Latin and Greek to have a written form. And so some of these sagas were actually taken down in writing by Irish Gaelic-speaking monks in Ireland and in places like Iona 1,000 years before the period I'm talking about. But the culture was also a strongly oral one. And so if not actually, then symbolically, I think, it was this way of living, this centuries-old system of belief, this product of a continuity that was now shattered, which his wife, his children, and his friends buried under that stone beside Hudson Bay, 201 years ago, as it happens this month. Now, Churchill and Bettyhill share the same latitude. They most emphatically do not share the same climate. I was in Churchill, Evelyn and I were in Churchill in December last year. My opening up of this venture to Evelyn was, how about a beach holiday just before Christmas? Eh? That's the beach. The days were sunny. There's the intrepid explorer looking out across Hudson Bay. That's not water, that's ice, right out to the horizon. That's all right. And the days, as you can see, that's my guide, or one of them, was Jim Oborn of the present-day Northwest Company, who organised our trip very much to Churchill. The days were sunny, as I say. That's Evelyn enjoying her beach holiday. And that's me having finally got inside and gave a talk there. And the mayor of Churchill, who was there, who has a Scottish name, Spence, but is the first Aboriginal Native American, not Native American, First Nation mayor of Churchill, but he has a Scottish surname, Spence. And he was telling me, in fact, that when he was a kid, his family and he used to sing Scottish songs on a Sunday evening.